Hello everybody, my name is Gabriel Lamas and welcome back to another week for the 5th graders. This is going to be, well obviously, the next video, and it's going to be about the founding of a nation in the United States and the original 13 colonies and how they were made and how different they were. So let's get right into it, and as you can see, we have the founding of the American colonies, and our friend Dobby here is going to help us. So, first of all, we have to start with governments and colonial charters, because that's the main reason that the Europeans, like the English, specifically the British, or the Spanish, were able to come over because of charters. So let's get right into it. First of all, we have to define some stuff. So, colonial charter is a royal contract defining land and law, and the joint stock company, and I'm just going to say this briefly because the next slide is going to be more in depth about it, is, well, there's a complex definition here: a financial engine where private investors shared capital and risk to fund transatlantic voyages. That's what I have there because that's the literal definition. But in simpler words, so I can make it easier for you guys, a joint stock company was basically just a company that people put money into, and these companies, they would go to the Americas and they would found their own things and found their own colonies. But these joint stock companies needed permission from the government to be able to found these colonies. So what was this permission called? Well, it was called a charter, which you can see on the right. Here's an example of what a charter actually looked like back then from Charles I. And yeah, right here it says where, which is Massachusetts Bay, and when, 1629, by who, just everything formal. So there's the charter, which is obviously the official document. Like I said, it's the form that the king or the queen gave to the joint stock companies or to whoever wanted to go to the Americas so they could found their colony. And it was just official permission. It was kind of like a law of the land, so they would be able to do it without being punished by the government or anything like that. And it explained everything that the joint stock company had to owe the king, because obviously the king wasn't going to give these companies land for free or charters for free. So it said that the companies needed to pay taxes or needed to give a portion of the resources they found back to the king. And yeah, that's basically what they did. It was a legal agreement, a legal form that basically just said, yes, you guys can have land in the Americas as a joint stock company, but you have to give me something in return from that land that you find. And it obviously says where and when you're going. Now, like I said, I was going to talk about the joint stock company more, so I'm going to right here. The rise of the joint stock company basically just happened at this time when everyone was moving to the Americas, when a lot of the Europeans were trying to travel to the Americas for the 3 Gs, gold, God, and glory. And if you don't really know what that is, go to one of my last videos because I already spoke about it. Basically, these joint stock companies became very big at the time because it was much easier. Obviously, 1 or 2 people alone, or a group of 5 people, wouldn't be able to make it all the way to the Americas alone because they wouldn't have money, they wouldn't have resources, they wouldn't have food, and if they made it there, they'd probably die of hunger or of Native Americans. So the joint stock companies were basically this group of investors. They came together to create this corporation, I guess you could say, and obviously there was different joint stock companies, and they came together, and since all of the people were investing in it at once, the company would have enough money to make these voyages, and that's when they'd ask for the charters so they would be able to go to the Americas. And not all of the investors of the joint stock companies went to the Americas. Some of the investors, well, most of the investors, they'd stay in Europe, and by staying in Europe, they would just tell the joint stock company to give them rewards or give them money back for what they invested into the company. Basically like a stock in real life. If you have $2 and you put it into a stock like Apple, let's say you make some money. That means that because you invested in Apple and the company's growing, Apple's going to give you some money back because the company grew and you made some money. It was the same thing with these joint stock companies. These people, these investors, were betting that the joint stock companies would be able to make money and make resources and everything like that in the Americas, and they were asking for someone in return when they came back. Now, charters were a very complex thing. I kind of dumbed it down for you guys, but that's because I was only talking about the most basic kind of charter. And there's still 3 other types of charters that I want to talk to you about, and that's why I split it up. First of all, we have a company charter. A company charter was formed by investors, and it was to meet company goals. So basically, a company charter was not a charter from the government. Like I said, the investors wanted to get some money or resources back. So a company charter was just a charter that the company made so the people or the investors could have like a paper or a form to look at when, well, I'll give you an example to make it easier. Let's say the people or the investors wanted to get some of their resources back, but the company wasn't giving them resources back. The company charter was there for that reason, because the company charter would say that these people were owed their resources. So, if worst came to worst, they could go address the government, and the government could step in and say that because this legal document said that, they had to repay the company had to repay the investors. Secondly, we have propriety charters, which was, like it says here, granted to individuals by the king as rewards. And basically, this one is kind of the more simple one. It was just like, let's say the king gave a charter to the Americas for a joint stock company. If they found like a lot of stuff, like something, like if they founded a whole village and found huge amounts of gold, the king would give this charter to them as gold. The king would give this charter to them as a reward for the gold, and they'd have full rights to govern and tax in that area that they own land in. Lastly, we've got a royal charter, and these were the ones that were directly from the British crown, and these were the ones that the king made to ensure all profits flow to the throne. The royal charter is the main one we're going to be talking about, and the royal charter is basically just the one where the king controls everything. The king is the one who gets the profit. He gets resources from the joint stock company, and he gives this charter to the joint stock companies. Basically, the royal charter was kind of the most important charter and the most powerful one at the time. Now let's talk about the corporate charters and the individual charters, or company versus proprietary. So, company, like I said, was that legal document that basically the companies made so they'd give resources back to the investors and prove everything, blah, blah, blah. So, right here, I've got a super complex thing, but I'm going to make it easy for you guys. Basically, all of these investors, like I said, they gave money, they gave ships, they gave supplies, they gave food, resources, they gave basically anything that the company or the colonists would need to them. But in return, what they were asking for was goods from the colonies that the joint stock companies would find there that were not found in Europe. And an example would be like fur or lumber. Basically, these European investors, they were giving away things that they already had and trying to get in return other things they wanted that they could not obtain in Europe, which was pretty smart by them. And then the company would sell these profits to England for profit. So they'd make a lot of money off of them. But because the investors had already invested in the company, they were making money they were getting these things simply because they had already paid beforehand. So it was kind of like, they were kind of like scamming them, I guess you could say, because these people, these companies, were selling these goods for way higher prices in Europe than for the investors. The investors, yes, they gave food and things like that, but it was not as much money as it costed people to buy these things after the fact. So it was a worthwhile investment and a worthwhile thing to put your money in. Now we have a proprietary charter. A proprietary charter, like I said, is another legal document. And the person who has control of it, or who it's given to, is called a proprietor. So basically, the proprietary charters were just given to people by the king. And these said that you could go and you could get land and control some land in the 13 colonies and get ownership and control of a certain colony. And these were kind of the basic charters of the colonies. You could govern the place, decide its purpose, make rules, manage taxes, all of that kind of stuff. These were the ones that were given to kind of leaders of the land, and these were the individual controls one, while company charters were corporate controls. But these two charters soon became less important and changed to the rise of the royal charters. Now, here in the picture before, you can see that there's proprietary colonies, which there's, if you see my cursor, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 proprietary. And company, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 proprietary and 6 company. Now, if you go to the royal charters, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you can see that a lot of the colonies that had either proprietary or company charters were taken over by royal charters, and Georgia, well, it was always a royal charter, so there's not really much of a change there. So they were already up and ahead. So basically, the royal charters came to a rise because in the mid-18th century, The American colonies, well, they were in a royal status. There was governors in these American colonies. So basically, beforehand, the reason that the proprietary charters and the company charters were the ones in place were because that these companies were, these colonies, they were owned or they were led by the companies, the joint stock companies, or the proprietors, the leaders of those proprietary charters. But these royal charters were not like that. These royal charters literally made governors and kind of like mini kings in the colonies. So there was their own royal bloodline in the colonies, and that's why they're called royal charters. And these royal charters had a lot more power than the other two, because it was taking power away from the companies and the proprietors and giving it to these governors appointed by the king himself, who could administrate, make laws, handle taxes, and basically do anything they wanted within the 13 colonies, which is one of the reasons that we broke away from Britain, because these governors were kind of overusing their power on us, which the Americans didn't like. Now, I've spoken all about the charters and the governance and things like that, but there's still much more in leading a colony. So now we're going to talk about geography and resources, something very important. So just to tell you the basics, there was 3 areas of colonies within the 13 colonies. New England, which was basically the northern area, the Middle Colonies, which you can see are orange, and then the Southern Colonies, which are green. And they were divided by their geography. So the Southern Colonies, they had flat coastlines and swampy land. So basically, these were the areas with rich soil that were very good for farming cash crops, which I spoke about in another video once again, so go watch it if you haven't. They farmed cash crops. It was a great way to make money and sell a lot of goods to Europe on the Southern Colonies. Then the Middle Colonies. The Middle Colonies, they had fertile valleys and mountains. So basically, the best thing that the Middle Colonies had were things like iron, fur, and grain production. Anything you could really find in a cave or in a forest or somewhere near a mountain was very good for the Middle Colonies. And the Southern Colonies was more farming and things like that. Now the Northern Colonies, well, Northern Colonies, a lot of people say had the worst geography, but that's not necessarily correct. Well, they didn't have any thick forests or mountainy things or caves or coastline or rich soil like the other 2 groups of colonies. What they did have was focus on maritime trade. Even though they didn't have a perfect coastline, they had a lot of lakes and a lot of entrances for ports and areas like that where they could fish, get lumber, get maritime resources like seashells. So these 13 colonies, even though some of them didn't have some of the things others had, the reason they worked so well together is because their geographies filled in for what the others did not have. So the Southern Colonies, sure, they didn't have mountains, but the Middle Colonies did. And none of them had lumber and maritime resources and fishing, but the Northern Colonies did. So all aspects of geography were tackled. Now, just to go deeper in it, the New England Colonies first. Well, the New England Colonies, they were rugged. They had woodlands, but not great forests that you could get many things from other than lumber. The rocky soil made it very hard to do anything. Agriculture was kind of sucky there. And everything pretty much sucked except the maritime culture. Even though it was inland, and even though, like I said, the coastline wasn't perfect, there's so many lakes and port entrances and just natural harbors created by the jagged coastlines and stuff like that, that it became the perfect place for anything by the sea, for maritime resources, for fishing, for shipbuilding, for literally anything in the water. Then, when we go to the New England colonies, we can see how they used the geography to their advantage. Obviously, like I said, they had fishing, they had maritime trade, and shipbuilding. So, with all of these resources they found in the woods and in the coastal waters and with the fish in the ocean, they were able to kind of make port cities and create manufacturing with all of this wood they were able to get. Obviously, they got lumber from the forests, they got whaling from the fishing and from the maritime trade, barrel and crate making from more wooden things, sawmills obviously because they were based by the water and they used a lot of lumber, and they had small scale farming because obviously every colony and every civilization needs some sort of crops and things like that to survive, but it wasn't very beneficial and it wasn't very worth it, which is why they focused on other things like maritime trade. Now, let's continue on to the Middle Colonies. The Middle Colonies, to go deeper into their geography, like I said, they had some nice soil, but not anything super great. They had some agricultural growth, But like I said, they had mountains, they had caves, and they had a lot of pretty decent forests where you could find certain animals. And they had rivers across the entire terrain of the Middle Colonies. The most famous and biggest mountain range in the Middle Colonies was the Appalachian Mountains. And the Appalachian Mountains were so good for this because around the Appalachian Mountains there was forests and things like that, and animals where they found fur. And in the caves of the Appalachian and around the Appalachian Mountains, they found iron. So this was the area where they gathered things like iron and like fur, which are kind of considered the luxury, wealthy people goods at the time in Europe. So you could say that this was the group of colonies where wealth was created. That for Europe, obviously. Then we can see how they used their geography. Like I said, there was coal and iron mining in caves. They obviously had manufacturing and trade because, well, every colony has that. They had agriculture because, like I said, they had pretty decent soil. Like I said, they had fur trapping around the mountains and in the forests. They had lumber in these forests, and they had grist mills. Grist mills, if you didn't know, are water-powered mills that process grain into flour and bran. So, in simple terms, they were basically mills. You guys have seen mills before. It's kind of obvious what they look like. And in these mills, they used water and they used lumber and all of the resources they had in the area to turn grain, or just little pieces of grain, into flour and bran. And this was very important because they used flour for a lot of things, and there was so much grain in the area that they were able to do this. And here we have grain farming. The grain farming was literally that they farmed grain. So with all of this grain farming, they could use the grain farming to make grist mills. And now, lastly, the Southern Colonies. The Southern Colonies, we know for the coastline, we know for the beaches, we know for the fact that they had nice fertile soil. They had subtropical climate. They had rivers. They had sunny areas. They had water. It was pretty hot. This was the perfect place for farming. This was the place where all of the money was made, but for the colonists. So in the Middle Colonies, all of the money that was made was given to Europe. But in the Southern Colonies, all the money that was made was given to the colonists. Why? Because they were doing all of the cash crops and things like that. And we can see how they use this to their advantage. Like I said, they used cash crops. Some examples, we have a bunch here, are indigo for dye and for clothing, tobacco because they used for smoking and things like that, rice, obviously, because people used it to eat and stuff, and sugarcane, which was kind of like a wealthy people cash crop, which obviously people liked for the sweetness. The problem with these Southern colonies was that there was a lot of labor. Because there was so much cash crops and so much plantations, I spoke about this in another video, but I'll touch upon it right now. They needed a lot of enslaved people from Africa and indentured servants to work on this land, which obviously became a whole problem with slavery. They had trading in ports just like every other area had. Their agriculture was the most important part, and their farming was very highly advanced. And Charleston was, I wanted to include, it was a southern port, and it was great for agricultural products and selling cash crops and things like that, and it was a major trading hub. Now, I'm done with geography, economics, and governments and charters. So let's go into the daily life. How their daily life looked like, and kind of what they did throughout their years and days and months. So, obviously, they had hard work and survival. They worked long hours. It's not like now where we go to it was not like now when we go to supermarket and we get, let's say, salmon or some meat or some rice. They had to work hard. They had to go hunting. They had to use a bonfire to burn and make the meat. They had to grow food for long hours. They didn't have anything advanced like us. And they had tradesmen, obviously, which were the people who practiced a specific trade. If you didn't know, sure, you can say a tradesman is someone that trades, but that's not what it really meant back then. It was someone that mastered their own craft. They mastered a specific area of work, like a blacksmith who mastered the iron welding or something like that, or an artisan or someone that makes pottery. They were the people that mastered their trade or craft, and people went to them. Women obviously raised children. They were the ones who stayed at home. They prepared food, and at the time, they still didn't have any rights, to be fair. So they were kind of just the ones who made food, preserved food, stayed at home, made the clothing. The children, they worked alongside their parents, and they just learned household skills and things like that. Obviously, indentured servants and slaves, well, they kind of just worked on the plantations. The only difference was that enslaved Africans had no freedom, and they were kind of just owned property, and indentured servants had a limited amount of freedom. But that limited amount of freedom wasn't much. Now, once again, let's go deeper. The families were obviously an important part of the workforce. Parents and children, they worked together. They had their own farms. They were ones who tilled the soil. They grew crops together, and they needed to work together because the parents alone would not be able to do all of this backbreaking, gruesome work. So they had to have the children do some other things, like care for animals. The dads or the men, they would teach their children things like carpenting and wood making and chopping down trees with axes, while the woman would teach their daughters more farming, more washing the clothes, more drying the clothes, much gentler things, I guess you could say, like that, and cooking. Like I said, women, they had these responsibilities of caring for their meals and caring for children and things like that. The indentured servants, basically, to give you an actual definition for an indentured servant, because I know I haven't done so yet, they were basically people who agreed to work for another person in an exchange for a specific number of years. So, simpler words. Let's say I'm an indentured servant and I live in France. But in France, I'm not making much money and I'm dying of hunger. What I would do is I'd become an indentured servant, the typical number was 7 years, for an American colonist or a proprietor or just any lord. I'd go on their land, work for 7 years, but after those 7 years, I would be a free man and I could do whatever I wanted for the rest of my life. So you would be sparing 7 years for the rest of your life, but you could not back out of the contract. Once you became an indentured servant, you could not leave until you finished. And that's what many people didn't like about it. That it was such gruesome work and that you didn't get much food and that you couldn't even run out of it later on. Then there was the apprentices who learned young things like carpentry and blacksmithing, which I touched upon already. The free white men were obviously like the peak of society, and they were kind of like the holy grail of people. And they were business owners and things like that who owned the land and were able to do whatever they wanted in their life. And then obviously there were slaves who were forced to work on the land. Now, religion is the last thing I'm going to touch upon, and I know the video is getting kind of long, so I'll try to wrap it up. Basically, conflict started to arise between different religious beliefs. So, there was Catholics in Maryland, there was Puritans in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, there was people that didn't even think religion should control the government, so he founded Rhode Island. The man was Roger Williams. Anne Hutchinson, she challenged Puritan religions and was banished from Massachusetts and also went to Rhode Island. Pennsylvania with William Penn, he was a Quaker. A Quaker is basically someone that wants complete peace and doesn't want anything wrong to happen in fighting. This guy was more chill, so he let people come in and was tolerant of religions. But in Maryland, it wasn't so much like this. This was a place where only Catholics and Christians were welcome. So as you can see, Massachusetts was very strict and they wanted only Puritans. Rhode Island with Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, well, they had religious tolerance and they were banished from Massachusetts because they wanted religious tolerance. In Maryland with the Catholics, it was only Catholics, but Christians came in later on, but it was still kind of just that sector of religion. And then Pennsylvania with William Penn, well, he was religiously tolerant as a Quaker. And like I said, a Quaker is right here on the 7th box with my cursor hovering over it. They want equality and they don't oppose religious tolerance and they want religious tolerance, like I said. But after all of these things happened, finally, religious freedom started to become a thing. Over time, the colonists realized that it wasn't really that deep. Anyone could believe in what they wanted to believe, so long as they didn't disrespect each other. And that's kind of what the world is now. Some people still disrespect, but most people are tolerant of religions and don't really mind what other people are, as long as they don't get offended for what they are. And lastly, I'm going to talk about Lord Baltimore, the last section of this video. Basically, it was the entire Baltimore family, and they founded Maryland as a colony with, well, this religious freedom. Like I said, there was Catholics, but it wasn't like Massachusetts where they banished people or anything like that. They let you live there. It's just that the Catholics were kind of like the predominant population, and they kind of led over everything. So there was George Calvert, First Lord Baltimore. He was a friend of King James I, and he wanted a colony with religious freedom. But he died before he finished. Then there was Leonard Calvert. He was the brother of Cecil Calvert, who I'm going to talk about now, and he was basically the one who was sent to Maryland to actually establish the colony. Cecil Calvert, who was Leonard Calvert's brother, he was the one who became the Baltimore, or the Lord, after George died. He was the one who colonized and really made Maryland with Leonard. He created the government, laws, religious tolerance, freedom, and then when he returned to England, he tried to regain control of Maryland, but he wasn't able to, and then eventually he died in 1661. So basically, this guy was the one who founded the entire colony, but he had to go back to England during the English Civil War, and then when he came back to Maryland, he had it for a little while, but then eventually died. Then we've got Charles Calvert, the third Lord Baltimore and the last one. This was Cecil Calvert's son. He obviously became governor in 1661 when Cecil died. He continued with Cecil's wish, and he kept going. He was the one who maintained religious tolerance and created a safe haven for all religions in Maryland. So now I've spoken to you about the 13 colonies, the politics, the religions, the economics, the geography. And what I want you to take away is that each colony had their own purpose, and it all started with that one ride across the ocean. So if you find this interesting, go check out another video. G Lamas out, and thank you for watching.